Hey, what is happening everyone? Welcome back to another video, and this is the PSP 3000 Disassembly, Reassembly, Cleanup, and Lubrication video for all 3000 revisions. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Yep, you heard that right, the 3000 model actually has 4 different revisions. That being said, in preparation for this video and a couple other ones, I went ahead and disassembled the majority of my PSP 3000 collection, including the ones that are unopened. Just so I can document the differences, make sure I know what I'm talking about, so I can take you step by step on how to take it all apart and put it back together while documenting all the differences. And speaking of differences, we're also going to have a PSP 3000 display comparison video, as well as a shell swap video and an LED indicator mod, where I'll show you how to change it to whatever color you'd like. But of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves, so stay tuned for those videos. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the modding table and show you how to disassemble it, clean it up, lubricate your UMD, and put it all back together. So let's get into it. Alright, so here we are with 2 units of 3000 models. We got the first generation 03G and the latest generation 09G. And using these 2 units, I can show you all the differences between all the other models. There are actually 9 revisions of PSP models and 4 generations of PSP 3000 models. And how we can tell which model we have is by running a homebrew called PSP ident. And as you can see right down here, it says PSP 2000, TA095 V2, and 09G, which is what this thing is. It's unnecessary for the disassembly, as I'll be showing you and guiding you through all the differences, but if you're interested, link will be in the description down below. So with that said, what tools do you need? Well, first you'll need yourself a screwdriver with a PH0 bit, and on some older revisions, you may also need a T2 bit. A pry tool with a chiseled tip could definitely be handy, but even more so, a cheap small flathead screwdriver such as this one. And finally, you'll need yourself a pair of tweezers. And this is really everything you should need for the disassembly and reassembly process. Now for the cleaning process, you'll need yourself a microfiber cloth, some type of brush, some isopropyl alcohol, preferably 99.9% so you can clean your electronics without having to worry about shorting anything or corroding anything, some dish soap, warm water, and possibly a container to contain your parts while cleaning them and reduce the chance of something going missing. Now as for lubricating the UMD, you may need some super lube and dielectric grease, or really any multi-purpose synthetic oil or lithium grease if you have any. Lastly, when putting everything back together, you want to make sure your screen is clean in case you got any fingerprints or lint. I personally use some window cleaner like Windex, alongside with some high quality tissue that's not going to leave any lint, and most importantly, my favorite tool, the blower, to give it a few blows before I close up everything to clear any dust off the screen and the faceplate. Lastly, of course, make sure you go ahead and test out your PSP before taking it apart, and if you need any of these tools, they can be found in the description down below if you're interested. So with that said, let's start the disassembly process. Alright, so first things first, open up your battery compartment, take out your battery if you got one installed, and eject your memory card. Now when it comes to the screws, we have a total of 7 screws on the outside, 2 on the top, and depending on which model you have, you may need a Torx 2 tip, or that same Phillips 0 tip. And if you have the T2, that's the only time you're going to be using it, only for the top and nothing else. 2 exposed on the right, and 2 inside the battery compartment, with one of them hidden under the warranty sticker. Now usually you'll find it right around here. In the case of the Japanese units, it's going to look like a backwards J, and that's where you'll usually find the screw. You just got to poke at it, dig around until you find it, and then unscrew right through it, which will rip the sticker, and then when you screw it back in, it's going to look a whole lot better than it would if you go ahead and remove the entire sticker. That ends up leaving some ugly residue with the words void. And lastly, on the bottom, we have 1 screw. And this 1 screw is going to be the exact same screw as these 4 on the back. Now you'll also notice on different models, you may have black screws or silver screws. That of course depends on your actual colorway or shell theme. Of course, for the later models that don't have the T2 screw on the top, you can use the exact same screwdriver for the entire process. Now that all the screws are removed, you can go ahead and pop off the faceplate. So what I like to do is usually start from the outer edges and work my way to the right side, where there's actually one very fragile clip that I'll show you in just a bit here. Sometimes it can be crusty and it can be very hard to remove, and it could definitely feel like there's another screw somewhere, but trust me, there isn't one. But once you go through it all around the edges, you'll notice that there's one part on the right here that doesn't want to go. And usually what I like to do, it can be very tough at times, especially the first time, is try to pop it open like this. I like to use my nails for most of the steps, as I don't want to apply too much pressure and possibly damage anything. It really gives me a good feel of what's going on. And then once that's done, you can just pop this right out. And here's what that little clip looks like. Again, the first time, it can be very tough, but if you don't have a nail or the pry tool, you can just grab it like so and force it to pop open. Alright, so first things first, for the faceplate, if you're going to be cleaning it, you want to put these parts into your little cleaning bin. And here's what you should have, in case anything goes missing moving forward. First you want to check is your little microphone gasket. If you didn't know, the PSP 2000 has a microphone, and it's located right over here. Usually it's supposed to stay where it is, right here. However, in most cases, it can get stuck to the front of the faceplate. And sometimes it's on there pretty well, but just make sure they don't lose this part and put it aside safely. And likewise for this other style model, go ahead and put it aside in your electronics bin. Moving on, we got the little ribbons right here. And you want to start off from the actual inner sides and carefully peel it open. There's usually a bit of adhesive right around here. Likewise with the other side, and also put those into your cleaning bin. Then we have the D-pad membrane. The D-pad However, when it comes to the face buttons, depending on which model you have, it may look like this or like this. You see, this little part right here is actually supposed to be under the speaker here. But over time, of course, it can get stuck, just like with the microphone gasket, and you can just peel it off like this and safely put it aside. So you can put all these parts into the cleaning bin and move on to the next step. Next, we got the analog stick. You just pop this right out, and now we can get to the fun part. For the older models, you start off by unclipping the bottom media bar by prying into this corner to pop it out. Then you push it slightly to the left, and it should peel away like so. However, don't pull it just yet. Now we need to actually go ahead and disconnect the screen. And to do that, my favorite way of doing it is to start off on the top left corner, and while lifting it, you want to push into it like so to pop out this side, and then I like to do the same thing for the other side, and then that should just pop right out. Now peel it away like so, and you'll find a nest of ribbon cables, which can be scary for a lot of people, and I personally do kind of find this part annoying, especially with the 3000 model's microphone, but here's how you can go about it. But before we go ahead and disconnect that one, let me go ahead and show you how to do it on the other revisions. Now for the newer models, you actually have to do a couple things just to remove this part to actually start disassembling everything. First, you need to remove the screw on the bottom left corner. Then you need to remove the bottom left part of the trim piece. And to do that, we simply just push up really anywhere, and this one should just come right out. So now we can do the same step like we did on the other one. And now before you go ahead and lift the screen, do note that there are actually two different screen retainers. With the older models, I like to call it the short one, where it just kind of sits there and it just keeps the display nice and even, which kind of acts like a screen backbone. However, for some newer models, they have what I like to call the wraparound screen retainer, which wraps around the display like so. Of course, if this is your first time removing it, it's going to be stuck on there a little bit. Just help it out and it should just pop right out. Again, here's what they look like. This is what I like to call the short and the wraparound. Alright, so with that out of the way, we can finally get to what I think is the hardest part for new beginners, and that is removing the displays. Since there's a plethora of connectors with really tight spacing, you can see how a lot of people could break these connectors. So here's how you can go about it. And by the way, when you're going through this process, relax, just follow the steps, and you'll be just fine. Alright, so for new beginners, here's what I recommend. Is to go ahead and fold yourself a piece of microfiber cloth to be double the thickness of your PSP, which then you can go ahead and fold over your display like so, and leave it like this. And once you have it set like this, make sure you hold onto the display, as if you accidentally shift anything, this thing can go flying backwards, and just keep your hand gently on it like this while you work on it. So first we're going to go ahead and disconnect the ribbon cables for the media buttons, starting with this one right here. Then we have this tiny one right here for the microphone. While holding the display, you can go ahead and wiggle this out. And if you need, you can poke at these little arms to help it out, and set it aside in your electronics bin. And once that's done, we can go ahead and lay our display back onto the microfiber cloth, and you can kind of adjust the height to see what works for you. This time around, you can have it around the same height of the actual PSP. Now later on in the future, if you have tested your connector, you can actually be a bit more rough with it. Once you know that your unit is safe to work on and doesn't have brittle plastic, maybe your PSP was under the sun or under some extreme heat for long periods of time, it can turn the plastic brittle and cause these connectors to break off easily. And by connectors, I mean this clip right here. That's usually the biggest failure point, alongside with the backlight. If you do that, it's not the end of the world. I can have a video about it in the future, but that's a topic for another video. But here's what I like to do with my favorite tool. I like to just kind of go at it, lifting it bit by bit, until the whole connector just pops out. For the backlight, just be gentle and give it a little nudge, and it should just pop open straight up. And you want to make sure that these connectors are fully open and not halfway open, because the next step, when you go ahead and wiggle your display to pop them out, could cause them to snag and may cause you to add extra force where not needed. If something that's not coming out, you can just kind of nudge it, help it out with the little arms here. And for the display connector, you can just kind of help it out with your finger. And that's pretty much the hardest part, in my opinion, for almost every beginner. And to keep it safe, you can go ahead and wrap it around like this to make sure that there's no dirt, debris, or fingerprints on it, and store it somewhere safe. Now here's me going at it my usual way. And again, put these aside into a safe bin. Alright, so we got through the hardest part. Now we can go ahead and move on to the fun stuff, like removing the triggers. So for the older models, they'll have one screw on each trigger, and once the screw and the retainer is removed, this thing just pops right out. As for the newer models, they switch to a cost-effective method of friction fitting. Yep, anyways, these go into the cleanup bin. Moving on, we can go ahead and remove the D-pad assembly, and you'll notice that the new models are quite different from the old models. In fact, the newer one has the LED indicators integrated into the same ribbon assembly, which you can tell with the bigger connector. Let me show you what I'm talking about. For the older models, we have one screw right here. Pop the connector open the memory card slot up, and side to side, carefully lift it. Now what you want to do is to go ahead and remove the left trigger membrane. And you can go about it a couple ways. You could slowly just go at it like this until you can remove all the adhesive under it. Use a hairdryer, or just some 99.9 isopropyl alcohol. Let it seep through, and it should just pop right out. As for the newer models, the Sony engineers decided that this screw was pointless. So this screw point right here is in fact going to be empty. Go ahead and pop this connector, except this time, you want to go ahead and lift this little tiny corner right up. Wiggle it side to side, some ISO, the good old chisel, and there she goes. So here's what they look like side by side. These are the two variants of your D-pad, the older one and the newer one. These can be broken down further into 4 parts: the speaker, the left housing, the ribbon cable, and the SD card slot. For the ribbon cable, I'm not going to do it. It's pretty self-explanatory. Throw some isopropyl alcohol, peel it off. It kind of wraps around here and goes into there. For the memory card slot, you just simply poke these things through, just like that. As for the speaker, it can be pretty confusing for the first time, but here's how you do it. You want to get a ledge right here, and that should just poke right out. And then you can put it back in the same way. Next up, we can go ahead and remove the analog stick. It's the exact same step for both. One simple screw right here, pop a connector, and pull it out. Next up, let's go ahead and move on to the power button. A single screw, and it should just come out like this. Taking it a step further, pop a connector, and completely remove it from the ribbon. Now when it comes to the newer connectors, you'll notice that once again, there is no screw. Again, a cost-saving measure where they figured out they actually don't need it. Now while we're here, we can go ahead and talk about the speakers, which as you can see, they look slightly different. If you remember, we had this little silicone piece that usually gets stuck to the face buttons, and it existed also on the 2000 models. However, with later models that don't have that silicone piece, instead they opted for a piece of foam that is stickered onto the speaker. So anyways, to pop this open, you simply push on this little lever, and here it is one more time. As for the charging port, it's got one screw that's keeping it into place, and if you opted to keep the sticker like I did, you'll notice that it's partially stuck to the charging port. So for that, a quick spray of isopropyl should do the trick. And any lettering you have here or here could get easily wiped off. And if you need to help it out, you can pry at it from this side, give it a few more sprays, and that will do the trick. Now pull it out. And to remove the connector, make sure you don't tug on it, make sure you don't lift it, as these connectors are actually very fragile and are prone to breaking. So my way of removing them is to get a flathead screwdriver, sandwich it in between the connector and the plug, and just pop it out like so, by simply twisting it. Now for the right combo connector, that houses the face buttons, right trigger, and the power switch board, we first want to go ahead and pop it open, pull it out, and you want to take note of these two little points, which will be poking through. And the easiest way to remove it, of course, is some with isopropyl. So slightly lift off this corner here, a couple sprays into it, and you want to start off with this corner, and with your pry tool, slowly work it through. And make sure that you're not separating the two layers, as this ribbon connector is actually made up of 2 layers that are folded onto each other to make these resistive contact points. So make sure you don't actually go between them and end up damaging the connectors on the inside. You want to make sure that you're in fact under the ribbon here. Fold it over, and it should just pop right out. If it needs any help, you know what to do. And by the way, another quick way to actually remove this, while you're holding it, you can just keep spraying until you can completely peel it off. And yes, you'll notice that some of them are different colored. These most likely came from different manufacturers. And yeah, the blue one does look pretty cool. Now let's move on to what I think is the biggest change, and that would be the Wi-Fi antenna. And this is important for people who are going to be shell swapping, because there are shells that are made for the old model and shells made for the new model. And again, we'll talk all about that in the upcoming shell swap video. But all you need to know is that the new models simply don't have a Wi-Fi antenna. It is all self-contained into the actual motherboard. So if you're someone who has a new model, you can appreciate this. So for that, instead of taking apart my Final Fantasy one, I'm just going to keep it as is. I don't want to ruin the original sticker. I'll be doing it on this beat up piano black. First, go ahead and disconnect the antenna by lifting it upwards, set it off to the side here, and flip it upside down, and now you have 2 options. The first option is going to be messy, and the second option is also going to be messy. You can first try to actually peel the sticker, and then put it back on, and depending on your luck, you may be successful, you may not. I'm not going to go into that. So what you could do is to actually get an outline of the shape by just going around it with your fingers. And with a razor blade, you can go ahead and cut around it. Now what you could do is to simply peel it off. Just like that. And you can either pull it out from this side, or the proper way is to actually pull it from this side. And that's what it should look like. Now if you're shell swapping, you can actually go ahead and clean this off under the sink. It's okay if it gets wet, just make sure you dry it off and the connector is fully dry before you reconnect everything. And then this should be cleared up. And then once you put on your new shell, you can put on the new sticker and it will hide all the blemishes. So you don't have to actually have it perfectly clean. Just make sure the sticker is off. Any glue residue can be covered with the sticker later on. So for now, just keep it with the other electronics. So anyways, let's go back to our Final Fantasy model. And for now, I'm just going to leave this hanging right there. And at this point, the only two things that are keeping this motherboard into place are these two UMD connectors. Pop this one open, ease it out. And for this one, it actually has two, so you have to do each side manually. And then you can try to wiggle out with your finger, just like that. And now you can simply just lift it off from this bottom left corner, give it a little wiggle while you pull it out. And don't forget about the mini USB connector, so you gotta gently ease it out here. There we go. So that's how it is for the new model. However, for the old model, we have this little tiny screw right here, which we need to go ahead and remove, followed by removing this trim piece by simply popping it upwards, throw into the cleanup bin, and now we can pull it out just like with the other one. So now that you have the motherboards removed, one very important thing you want to take note of are these little levers on the back here. They're very fragile, and they're very crucial for the UMD's function, as they detect when you have a disk installed. Now for the older models, you actually have a second one right here that is no longer present on the newer ones. And of course, at this point, you can go ahead and replace your supercapacitor if you watched my supercapacitor video, which I'll leave a link for in the description down below. Moving on, we got this little shield right here. And with the old model, they kind of went overboard with one screw. That is, of course, no longer present on the new one. So just lift it and pull it to the left. And the same thing for this one. And that should just pop right out. So now we get to the fun part, and that would be removing the UMD. So with the older models, just like with the 2000 series, they got a little plastic retainer right here. They can simply just pop right out like so. And what that does, it keeps the spring in check. So we can simply just pull out like so. That spring, of course, is used for the UMD door, which as you can see, it is now floppy. However, when it comes to the new models, again, they went for some more cost-saving measures, and that would be to integrate the spring retainer with the actual trim piece. So for this one, you just push it up, just like with the other one, and that whole piece should just pop right out, likewise with the spring. And while we're here, we might as well go ahead and show you how to remove the trim piece on the top here. Push outwards from this corner. Same thing with the left side. A little poke right here, another poke right there, and there she goes. And now we can finally go ahead and show you how to remove the dreaded UMD door, which I think is the second annoying part for a lot of beginners. So here's how you do it. You first open the door, you get on the floor, and then you do the dinosaur. Put your small flathead screwdriver all the way in, and while pushing in, you want to pull the UMD door. And that should just pop right out. And you can disconnect the two rails by pushing them downwards. Of course, here it is once again. Now, of course, you could help it out by actually bending the shell here ever so slightly while prying at it. And for reference, here's what that looks like up close. That is how it's actually kept in place. Now, the next difference you'll find between the old models and the new models is how this hinge is held into place. With the older models, you'll first have to remove these two pieces of rubber that are keeping the hinge into place. Because how you remove them is by pulling them outwards, like so. Just one side is enough for the older models. And these things are not necessary. If you do lose them, it's okay, as you can just bend these prongs ever so slightly inwards and they'll stay in place. Now, for the newer model, it's slightly different. Again, some more cost-saving measures. So this one actually just comes up by the top and then that's it. And that's because you'll notice, unlike the older one, which is on the left, the newer ones have an opening and the whole mechanism is completely different. And finally, we can go ahead and remove the UMD by removing these 4 screws. These are 4 unique screws that are flat, short, and kind of chubby. You can pull it out however you like. Just make sure that you take care of the ribbon cables as you're pulling them out, and that you don't lose any of these silicone pieces. They're very crucial as they keep the UMD nice and solid and reduces the vibrations that you may have, which could result in a bunch of different problems like not reading or possibly damaging something like your disk. So you want to take your time and carefully remove it if it's stuck like this. You could use some isopropyl or some soap and water just to help it out like so. Don't worry about it, it's not going to dry out. Just poke it back into place and set this thing aside. Now you may think we're done, but we got 2 more things, and that would be the accessory mounts, which are screw points, as well as the UMD's locking mechanism. So this is going to be the same exact step for both models, and here's how you can go about it. You want to poke at these 2 little tabs until the whole thing bends inwards, and the rest should just come right out. Now I want to carefully poke the spring out and store it somewhere safe. And finally, for these 2 little guys, you can get your flathead screwdriver and just poke it out outwards into the UMD slot. Just like that. Of course, you don't have to do all these steps. You can only do the ones you need or you think you need. Like these parts and the spring mechanism, sometimes the included ones with the shell swaps kind of suck, so I usually take the original ones, pop them in, and I can save myself a headache later on. Alright, so let's get started with the cleaning process. So I've got both PSPs right here. Now it would be better if you had one PSP, especially if you have a small bin like mine here. So I'm going to take the white one out and show you how to clean things using the blue one. First off, get yourself some dish soap, as well as some warm water. Grab your brush, and you basically just start scrubbing. Usually, most of these edges can get crusty if you buy a really dirty unit from eBay. The inside, usually not so much, but why not? Might as well go over it. Always make sure you get a visual of where the dirt is before you actually get it wet, because sometimes it can disappear. And then once it's dry, you'll find out that you'd actually clean it properly. But as always, the edges is where the dirt usually settles into. Especially the control openings. You definitely want to work it through and make sure you got everything in from both sides. Now, of course, during this process, you could possibly add some micro scratches into your actual lens from the inside and out. You can always change it with a glass lens and not have to deal with any of those headaches. And you may not notice anything because your lens is already scratched up. So since you have your PSP already opened up, it'll be a good time to upgrade. Now for these parts, I like to just get my brush with long bristles and just go at it like this. For these harder to get to areas. If you have a paintbrush, why not? Now when it comes to lettering like this, where the letters are embossed, the best way to go about it is using a hard brush with nice pointy bristles. I got this one off AliExpress and I really like it. And alongside with just going at it like this, with the usual way in circles and whatnot, I like to also poke it in, as the bristles can go in there and just kind of spread outwards and clean up all the crevices. That's my little trick for those letters. For the power switch, if there's any dirt in it, you can just pull it out. Then you can go over it like this. Here's another area where it can get pretty annoying, so having a nice strong brush is pretty useful. With things like the D-pad, you want to make sure you use your softest brush because any little marks you may add can take away from the shine and you may need to polish it later. Just go over it with a nice soft brush and you should be good to go. And when it comes to the face buttons, you want to be extra careful. They are pretty fragile. Again, just go over it softly. Get into all the nooks and crannies. Just make sure you don't add too much pressure and rip something out. A part that can get very dirty very quickly over time, and any amount of dirt on it will make it look very nasty. So a nice hard brush will come in handy here. And if you don't have a brush, get yourself a microfiber cloth, get away with some soap and water, and just basically go at it like this, or the other way around like this. And those two methods should give you an absolutely perfectly clean analog stick, so long that it's not deformed. Of course, we can't forget the screw points, the Sony logo on the battery cover. And again, it's okay if you actually get your Wi-Fi antenna wet. Alongside with the sticker, just make sure you dry them off real quick after you're done. And there we go, we got this little indentation. We can just clean that up like this. And now it's perfect. I recently bought this one with another one here. There's a blue one and an orange one. And just remember that the orange one actually comes with two tips, one plastic and one metal. So make sure you don't use the metal one, of course, because you're going to scratch everything up. But it does have a plastic part, so if you want a 2-in-1, you can get the orange one. If you just need the plastic one, you can get the blue one. And I think they're like $1.50 each or something. Finally, of course, we got the triggers. I mean, there's not much to it. You don't want to go too crazy on them because you can end up scuffing them up and they won't look as shiny as before. Oh yeah, and finally for the media buttons, they're pretty fragile, so make sure you put it somewhere safe like your palm and just go over it with a soft brush like this and you should be good to go. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty self-explanatory. So now I'm going to go ahead and do it for the white one, which is absolutely nasty as you can see. In short, scrub everything well, and if you have any tiny crevices that are stubborn, simply use a sturdy brush to clean it thoroughly. And once you're done, you can go ahead and wash everything, set it off to dry, while you work on your electronics and lubricating your UMD. So to clean your motherboard, it's pretty simple. You really don't have to do much, unless of course you got some water damage or some Coke syrup. Then you want to get yourself some 99.9% isopropyl alcohol or some contact cleaner, and just go over it with a brush on this side, making sure that everything is nice and clean. If your memory card slot isn't working too well, again, some isopropyl alcohol, maybe some contact cleaner, and while your contacts are still wet, clean the contacts, spray it again, to hopefully clean those contacts. Now for the rest of it, you can just go over it with a brush like this. Again, you don't have to spray anything if your motherboard looks clean. If it's just dusty, just go over it like this. You can also get yourself a Q-tip. You can slightly pull the top off to make it smaller, hit it with some isopropyl alcohol, and you can go ahead and clean your headphone jack. Basically wrench it and blow through it from this side until it's all clean. And finally, if your video output is dirty, well, a paintbrush can definitely come in handy. Like I mentioned before, be careful of your UMD sensor right here. It can easily break and you'll end up with a non-working UMD unless you bridge it or something. But I'm not going to get into that for now. And if you have soldering tools and you have a CMOS battery, will be a good time to replace this thing right here if it's not keeping time. And if you're dusting your motherboard like this, make sure you're actually going with the actual sensor and not against it, because this will snap it. But this way, the sensor actually folds forward, so it's perfectly fine. And lastly, we have the USB mini port. If it is dirty, go ahead and spray it, hit it with your paintbrush, and it should be good to go. And there's actually one last thing here, and that would be these little two contacts. If you have any of those accessories like the GPS, the camera, or even the TV module, and they're not detecting correctly, well, you actually have to clean these little pins right here. And to do that, is I like to get a small piece of aluminum foil, fold it over, and just use it to clean these contacts. You can use some isopropyl alcohol if you need, and once they look nice and shiny, or better than before, then you should be good to go. For these things, not a whole lot you could do. Just hit it with spray, make sure it's clean, and leave it as is. If it's not broken, don't remove it. Keep it as is, just clean around it, and that's it. As for the analog stick, it can sometimes get pretty dirty, and if yours is working perfectly fine before, do not open it, just hit it with a brush on the outside, don't spray it or anything, unless it's like gummy or something. Then you can just clean it with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol. Otherwise, don't touch it, don't open it up, leave it as is. If it is broken or drifting, well, I plan to do a deep dive on these things sometime in the future, so maybe just stay tuned or just buy a replacement. The speakers I would just dust, make sure that there is no residue. Do not hit them with isopropyl alcohol, I highly recommend against it. It could ruin it. These things already have a mesh on them, so the speakers are perfectly safe. Just dust them off and it should be good to go. For these things, what you do is simply just clean off the contacts in preparation for the reassembly. These things usually are pretty clean. I rarely see them get dirty, so just dust them off and that's it. Make sure you don't get any isopropyl alcohol on the microphone. It could also damage it. And again, what you can do for the Wi-Fi antenna, you can peel it off. If it doesn't work out, you can go under the sink, wet the whole thing until the whole label is nice and soft. Then you can just scrape it off with your nail or a piece of plastic. Looks like this time I'm kind of lucky. I can just peel it off. And it should end up with a little something like this. It's okay if you have any remaining glue residue. It's perfectly fine. Once you do the shell swap, it'll be covered with a sticker anyways. And lastly, for electronics, we have the UMD drives. So if these things are dirty, they can have a plethora of issues. And the issues can range from games not running at all, to sometimes working, where one game would work and the other would not, and then the next day it would be the other way around for whatever reason, all the way to some very noisy UMD drives, where they have a bunch of ugly screeching noises every time you're running them. And that can be very annoying. So here's what we're gonna do. First, we'll start off by cleaning them, lightly dusting them, nothing too crazy, making sure that we don't get the lens dirty by accidentally touching it or going over it with a brush. Then we'll get some lubrication. I personally use some super lube and dielectric grease. Lithium grease can also work, or multi-purpose synthetic oil can also work as well. So let's get to it. First thing I like to do is to remove these little rubbers. And if they're dirty enough, you can go in and wash it with some soap and water. And you'll want to inspect everything, see where all the dirt is. And sometimes if you've got a bunch of dirt stuck on here, on the back of the sticker, you can just simply rip it off. It's not a big deal. So that's what it looks like on some of the older models. Here's what it looks like on the newer models. They have decided to add this little sticker here to kind of protect the little motor down here. But other than that, they're almost the exact same. So for this one, we'll go ahead and unpeel the sticker. And to clean the residue here, you can simply get some isopropyl alcohol and just go over it with a Q-tip or a piece of tissue. Once that's done, of course, go ahead and brush everything. Make sure that it's nice and clean on both sides without touching the lens. Next, if you got a bunch of dust stuck to the grease here, go ahead and clean up with a Q-tip, and likewise for the back part right here. And once you're done doing that, you can grab your dielectric grease or lithium grease and apply a liberal amount on this side as well as the other. Sometimes I like to add a little bit here too. Then carefully move this thing back and forth inside the rail here. And then you can go ahead and grab your Q-tip or tissue and wipe off any of the excess material. Again, making sure that you don't get any of it on the lens. Be extra sure and careful of that. Once that's done, we can grab our oil and add some of it in the following locations. 1 drop right here, some into this little hole, these 3 openings, 1 in the middle, 1 over here, quick drop right there. Then you want to flip it over, 1 around here, 1 drop, another here, and finally right here. Now go ahead and have it spin. Move these parts back and forth. Same thing with the back side. And once that's done, you can go ahead and roll up a piece of tissue, fold it over, and just lightly dab everything to remove any of the excess oils. As the last thing you want when you're actually using this thing is to have a bunch of oil spinning and spinning everywhere when you do a transparent shell swap, or even worse, on your UMD game. And once the lubrication is done, what you want to do is to grab yourself the cleanest piece of tissue that you have, or microfiber cloth, and lightly and gently go over the lens, making sure that there is no debris and it's pretty clean. One thing you want to take note of is that the lens here is actually floating on top of the sensor, and the sensor is fully exposed to all the elements. And to clean the sensor and possibly the lens as well, I like to get my favorite tool, the blower. These are usually used for camera lenses. It's just a bulb and they blow air. And I have 2 uses for them when it comes to the PSP. one for the UMD sensor and lens, and the other one is for the actual display before closing everything back up. Again, they come in different shapes and sizes and price points, and I'll leave links for them in the description down below if you're interested. And how you use it is pretty simple. Just simply blow into the lens/sensor that is under it to clear any possible debris that may be under it. I prefer the one with the nozzle. It gives you more control and more output. And that's pretty much it for the UMDs. Clean up, lubrication, move the mechanics, clean off the access, wipe the lens, and then blow the lens/sensor. And before you go ahead and install it, double check that you don't have any leftover residue that could spin off and get annoying to clean up later on. So now we'll go ahead and clean these things off, then we can get started with the reassembly process. Alright, so now that everything is nice and dry, we can finally start with the reassembly process. So let's get to it. Starting with the UMD clip. But before we do that, we gotta install the accessory mounts. And these go in exactly how you remove them. And once they're seated, you can go ahead and push them in to lock them into place. And you can check from the top here that they are in fact sitting correctly, right in the middle of the circular openings. And if you need help, you can take your screwdriver again and push them into place. Next up, grab the UMD lock, angle it downwards, and then push in the middle part, as well as the right and left sides, until it all clips in, double checking that these tabs are sitting correctly from the back. And finally for the spring, you can go ahead and install it from here using a pair of tweezers, and it needs to fit between the two prongs. Once done correctly, it should now be spring loaded. Now let's go ahead and grab your UMD, and go ahead and install the little rubber pieces. Slide the drive all the way to the right, making sure to feed both cables into these little openings before dropping it into place. And now we can go ahead and screw it back into place. And these use, of course, the 4 chubby screws. And this is how your cable should look like from the back. Next, we'll grab our UMD door, as well as our hinge. And what you want to do is line one side up into one of the prongs, and the other one, bend it ever so slightly outwards until it clips in, just like that. Just make sure that they're either straight or slightly bent inwards so they can stay in place without the need of these little rubber pieces. Next up, we got these prongs on both sides. And what you want to do is line both of them up at the same time on the bottom opening of the rail and then slide them upwards. Once you do that, you'll notice that it's now secure and none of them are slipping off. And now once both sides are in their place, without letting them slip by going downwards, you want to push in the bottom right corner. Push it in like so, while keeping the door as far open as you could. And then once that's done, we can move on to the other side. And while slightly bending the shell, you want to push the actual door into its prong. Just like that. And if done correctly, both rails should be in there, and it should open and close pretty smoothly. As for the newer models, the steps are kind of reversed. You want to start off by actually feeding the rails first into the door, and while holding them into place like this, we'll go ahead and feed it from the top. And that, I would say, is the easiest way to do it for the newer models. So now, feed the bottom right, and then the bottom left, and there we go. Next up, we're going to go ahead and install the spring, and it's going to be the exact same process for both of them until we get to the spring retainer, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So I'll quickly do one right here, show you how it should sit, and then take you step by step on how I went about it. Alright, so here's what we have. We got 2 spring legs. One of them goes through this little opening and sits into this little crevice. The other long one goes to the little arm that is from the UMD door. And here's what the mechanics look like. Of course, that's going to happen if you don't have your retainers. So let's go ahead and install it. So here it is once again on the blue one. So once you finally get it to sit, make sure you don't open the door, otherwise it's going to slip. Then you'll have to go through the annoying process once again. Now, for the old models, and PSP 2000 models as well, they have this little plastic retainer. And this one is pretty simple. You just drop it into place, and then clip it like that. As for the newer models, the retainer is now part of the actual trim piece. Of course, make sure you don't forget your power lever. And once done correctly, you can finally go ahead and enjoy your spring-loaded door. And since we're still on the topic of trim pieces, we might as well go ahead and install the top one. So go ahead and grab it alongside with the Wi-Fi switch. And best to start it from the Wi-Fi side, clip that into place, and then move your way around to the other side. You can just simply drop it in, and you should be good to go. Now let's go ahead and drop in this little shield, which I sometimes forget. And I did forget, and I had to re-record this entire section, so screw it into place. As for the newer models, you simply drop it in and slide it to the right. Once that's done, we can now go ahead and reinstall the motherboard. So there are 3 things you want to take note of. First of all, these 2 cables, they have to be above the motherboard when you're installing it. And the second thing would have to be the Wi-Fi switch. Make sure it lines up with the lever right here. Otherwise, if it's not aligned, you could possibly break it. and then you install it inwards with the USB port going in first. Line that up, pull these cables, double check everything before clipping it into place. Now we can go ahead and reinstall the ribbon cables, and this one just kind of sits like that. I like to get my pair of tweezers and do it at the same time, or you can do one side at a time, back and forth, until they're both secure. The other one down here, close that up. And now for the Wi-Fi switch, well, it's pretty straightforward. Feed it in from this side, line it up and make sure it's nicely seated. If you want to help it out, you can put some double-sided tape or a couple dabs of B7000 glue, and then you want to feed it through these little openings all the way around here before clipping it into place. And here's a better visual on the white model. Of course, it's the exact same steps on the newer models, except we don't have to deal with the Wi-Fi antenna, which is nice. I should also mention that it will be a good time to actually clean off the contacts here with some isopropyl alcohol and maybe a piece of tissue or a cotton swab, as these can get dirty and it could affect the UMD drive. Now let's go ahead and install the analog stick, and the easiest way to do it is to pop open the connector, install the ribbon cable, lock it into place, feeding it under the motherboard, and screwing it into place. And yes, sitting like this is actually normal and how it's supposed to be, so don't worry about it. It's not going to be perfectly straight, it's going to be slightly angled, and that's completely normal. Next up, we got the left side assembly. Quickly pop in the memory card cover, and while the cover is still open, drop it into place, hold it above ever so slightly, while you open the cover, line the connector, and install it into place. Then the rest of it should just drop in. The existing adhesive is usually enough, but of course if you wanted, you can add some thin double-sided tape or a small drop of B7000. And for the old model, we're just going to have one screw down here. Now with the newer models, it's slightly easier, as the cable here has more slack, so we can easily line it up and clip it into place. Plus, we don't need a screw here. And by the way, if this looks wrong, that's how it actually came from the factory, and it was working perfectly fine. Oh yeah, I forgot the speaker. Now let's move on to the right side. Grab your connector, connect it into place, then line it up here, here, and here. And again, the original adhesive should be perfectly fine to use, but if it's not, you can add a couple drops of this stuff. So make sure it's flat all around, line up the right trigger, and then connect the power switch. Of course, you can do any of these steps in almost any order. Now leave it as is, and grab your charging port, drop it into here, then feed your cables under this guide, and carefully connect it. And the safest way to go about it is to compress it like so, and secure it with a single screw. And I'll just quickly do the same thing for the newer model. Now at this point, for the older models, you can go in and install your trims, starting with the left side. Lift it off, slide it into place. Now for the power switch, you want to line up with the bottom pin, top pin, and of course, the outside lever. Just like that. Then you can go ahead and screw it into place. Of course, it's the exact same step for the new model, except it doesn't require the screw. Just clip into place and leave it as is. Now for the right speaker, you want to line it up at the top like so, and then just push it into place. Sometimes you need to help it out by readjusting this little prong that is bent from factory to act as a little spring, and that keeps this little tab in check so it doesn't jump out. Slide it in at an angle, slightly twist it to the right, and then clip it into place. For the old model, drop in your silicone cover for the speaker. As for the new model, again, it doesn't have one, it's already integrated. So at this point, we're almost there. Now let's drop in the triggers, trigger retainer screws. As for the newer model, the triggers just drop in, the retainers don't have any screws. The analog top. And now we are at the annoying part where we go ahead and reconnect the media buttons, the screen, and the faceplate, while making sure that there's no dust or fingerprints between the screen and the lens. Let me show you. So pop open your connectors, slide them in, and lock them. Then you move on to the screen connector. Making sure that it's fully in, and then you can just go ahead and close it off. For the old model, the screen retainer can be just dropped in. Then you can secure the screen into place. And it's okay if it doesn't fully clip in and sit flush and it's kind of bouncy like this. It is perfectly fine. And then we can simply clip that on top. And finally, can't forget the little dust cover. Now for the newer model, lock in the media buttons. We can lift off the screen ever so slightly to connect the wraparound screen retainer and slide it into place. And again, don't forget your microphone gasket. We put the bottom left trim at the end. And before it can actually clip into place, we have to actually slide it behind the right one. Yeah, it's kind of annoying, but you can just kind of finesse it like this, and you're pretty much good to go. And now we have one final internal screw, and that will be the one in the bottom left corner. And this of course applies for all models. Alright, so while you guys weren't looking, I went ahead and upgraded the Final Fantasy one with a glass lens. But yeah, now will be a good time to bring out all the cleaning tools that you have. So, of course, a clean microfiber cloth, some Windex, maybe some isopropyl alcohol, and a good quality box of tissue. Oh yeah, we can't forget the blower thingies. That's the most important part. Alright, so here's how my usual cleanup routine goes. It can get tedious, but over time, you kind of get used to it, and the results speak for themselves. So, first you want to inspect your screen. If it doesn't have any fingerprints, usually you don't have to touch it up with any liquid. You can first try blowing it, if you have the blower, of course. You can use your mouth, but, not recommend it. Of course, if you don't care, you can just close it up and whatever. Then if I don't have any fingerprints, and the blower thingy is not working, I can take a nice, clean, high-quality piece of tissue that doesn't leave any lint when it's a fresh one, and just lightly go over it to push anything out. And then, of course, go over the duster to make sure that everything is nice and clean. Now, of course, some fingerprints, you could possibly just wipe it off, and you can try. And if it does go away, then great. Again, I use my trusty blower. Now you can go ahead and grab your faceplate and get a good visual of what's going on. You'll see that there's a bunch of debris on both sides, and it's going to make it really hard to figure out what's going on. So first thing you could do is to go ahead and clean up the faceplate. One spray of Windex. And since I installed the glass lens, we're getting some squeaks. Once I'm done with the tissue, I can go over it with a microfiber cloth, and now we can get a good visual by placing it upside down, or just directly like this. So we can see that there's a whole lot of debris and dirt under the lens. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing. This time I'll grab another piece of tissue. Then I'll go over it with a microfiber cloth again. Of course, it would be a good idea to work on a clean surface, maybe get a piece of paper and start working on it. And if you have a black piece of paper, even better, then you can quickly visualize what's going on. Get a couple specks here and here, one right there. So that looks pretty good. Now I can go in, drop in the face buttons, D-pad, D-pad membrane, and of course the media buttons. And you want to push these areas down as they have the original adhesive. Now if they're not sticking and they're constantly falling off, you can do either of two things. You can either glue it with a double-sided tape or a very small drop of B7000, but you have to be careful that it doesn't get on the screen and then you have to actually clean it up. You can simply grab yourself a piece of tape and stick it where your media buttons are. That way they can stay in place as you screw it back into place, and then you can remove it once you're done, just like that. And while doing that, I ended up touching it, and of course some other dust particles landed on the screen, so I'm going to go ahead and recheck my work. I see some slight edges here, but it's not a big deal. Just going to go over it like this. Give everything one last blow before closing it back into place. Again, making sure that you don't snap this thing off and that it sits inside the PSP and not outside, because if you do, it's going to break. Clip the top in, check that everything can sit nice and flush, and now we can go ahead and re-screw everything back together. Starting with the ugly screw that has the distorted top, we'll throw it where the sticker is, and pick your cleanest one for the bottom, the two right ones, the top left one, and finally, of course, since this is one of the earlier models, we're going to have to switch to the T2 tip, and while holding the top cover into place, we can screw it in. Now a quick tip, if you have rusty screws like this, one thing I like to do is to get a piece of sandpaper, maybe some WD-40, and lightly go over them until I can get somewhat of a cleaner surface. One last wipe, remove the tape, install your battery cover, memory card, one last wipe before we go ahead and finally turn it on. And that's all there is to it. We have fully disassembled it, cleaned it up, lubricated the UMD, and put it all back together safely on two different models that represent all the different revisions of the 3000 model. And now I got myself an absolutely beautiful clean PSP. I got this one for around $68 on Japan For You, and it was kind of dirty, but now it's pretty pristine in my opinion. But yeah, that is all for this video. I'm gonna go ahead and try out this new Minecraft release. We got a ton more exciting stuff coming up, and I cannot wait to get through them. Things like online multiplayer, dual analog stick mods, just so I can play this new release of Minecraft, which includes the Nether, and it looks absolutely stunning. Anyways, that's all for this video. Thank you all for watching. If you have enjoyed this video and found it helpful, hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care, everyone.